This is Jerome Corsi, and today is Tuesday, April 18th, 2023. I'm here with my producer, Chris, and we have a lot of news to cover today, so we're going to get right to it. The first story I want to cover has to do with the Ukraine economic situation. It's been really not well reported in the United States. It's beginning to be noticed, but there's a split in the EU, in the European Union. Poland and Hungary have placed a ban on Ukrainian food imports, largely grain, because they're concerned that the glut of grain from Ukraine is just dumping this grain into the European market, is going to create a flood of European grain, which will lower the price for everyone. And both Hungary and Poland are very heavily dependent on being able to market their own grain. Now, if Hungary, Slovenia, Romania, Poland, all these countries block, and these countries are forming a bloc within the EU, and block Ukrainian food product transit coming through their countries, it effectively would result in a geographical blockade in Europe as the four countries border Ukraine. So essentially, you've got a dispute going on where the EU is not united. Has never really been united, but this is another indication. The EU is, in many ways, a divided set of different priorities. Hungary has been very opposed to the globalization and to the new world order of the World Economic Forum, and Hungary wants to maintain the conservative tradition of Hungarian sovereignty, which seems pretty reasonable to me. At any rate, this is a growing issue, growing problem, and Ukrainians are getting pushed in every possible way. Ukraine's production of wheat is largely in the western part of the country near Germany. That's where they're producing the wheat and also sending it out through Crimea or the Sebastopol. It's internationally marketed, and the world does depend a lot on Ukrainian grain. But the point is, this kind of economic pressure that Ukraine is under right now, and we're sending billions to Ukraine. I'm not sure what's well, actually, Ukraine's a very corrupt country. I think almost anyone would suspect that the money is being stolen to some large extent. Certainly, the European producers of grain aren't getting that money. And the Bakhmut fighting, the Russian pressure on the city Bakhmut, which is a key strategic position near the Donbass, the eastern part of Russia, where it's closer to, eastern part of Ukraine, closer to Russia. And it's intensifying the fighting. I think the Russians are really pushing. They're shelling the city. They're having air attacks in the city. Their tanks are bombarding the city. Basically, Bakhmut is a shambles. About 75,000 people live there. It's now today in ruins. And what the war is doing, what Russia is doing essentially is decimating the cities in Ukraine one by one. Ukraine's constantly talking about a counterattack, but I think it's just a ploy for getting more money for the government and for the oligarchs in Ukraine to steal. Okay, I've got a couple stories here. One more story in economics, which I think is very important. We're seeing this rise of the yuan, instead of the petrodollar, which has been the dollar being the basis for oil trade and also the reserve currency of the world. Now China is exerting its yuan that way. This is a very good article because what it does is it goes back to trace the origin of the London gold pool, which was formed in 1944. There was a treaty formed in Bretton Woods, which is up in Washington State, where the allies, the countries fighting Germany and Japan, decided they were going to enter into a new economic order after World War II. The dollar would become their standard of international trade. which means the countries all would go into dollars to swap their own currencies. If someone in Germany and on marks at that time wanted to buy something in Russia and rubles, they would both trade in dollars, which the countries maintained as their foreign exchange reserves for that purpose. The London Gold Pool was created initially to keep the price of gold at $35 an ounce when we were on the gold standard. But in 1967, the London Gold Pool collapsed due to a shortage of gold and demand for the metal, which was increasing. Since 1967 was the beginning of the end of the Bretton Woods international monetary system that had been in place since the end of World War II. And it ultimately led to severing the dollar's tie with gold, which happened in 1971 under Richard Nixon. So the dollar since 1971 has been a fiat currency. The petrodollar system has been one of the major things that have kept it going, and that the oil-producing countries around the world have continued to trade, buy, and sell in dollars. And what's going to happen is if that collapses, and there's signs of it the main sign this article is pointing to is that in 1967, when this London Gold Pool collapsed, the central banks were buying an enormous amount of gold. And that's happening again this year. The central banks are buying an enormous amount of gold. And what the article concludes is that we are in the middle of a major paradigm shift in international finance that is hard to perceive as it's happening, and most people won't realize it's going on. But again, you get this Gulf Cooperation Council, which President Xi in China, he visited Saudi Arabia. They call it the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, which includes Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, Oman, and the United Arab Emirates. They account for about 25% of the world's exports, with Saudi Arabia alone 17% of the world exports. And China, about 25% of China's oil comes from Saudi Arabia. And China is the largest trading partner of this group, and China wants to trade in yuan. After years of also work, the Shanghai International Energy Exchange is launching futures of crude oil based on the Chinese yuan. That started in 2008. Now, all of this means a shift in the balance of power in the oil market away from the United States. And as the U.S. dollar is losing value, it's lost about 99% of its purchasing power since 1971, other countries are going to increasingly rely on gold. And I think you'll see China and Russia aim to create some form or other of their currency that is gold-backed. That will severely hurt the United States and reduce our standard of living. Now, Chris, if you'll go to I had a question on one of the comments yesterday with Swiss America, and it's Swiss America is, of course, our sponsor. That Walking Liberty $50, if you'll fill out that form, you can talk with them. It's a one-time offer to buy these Walking Liberty $50, which are about 90% silver, for just about what they cost. It's a loss leader to Swiss America, but it's a way to introduce yourself to them and begin discussing your needs to have some tangible gold and silver that you can hold in your hand and have as real value that you've invested in. Now, the question was, if dollar is going to be worthless, why does Swiss America want to sell gold for dollars? Well, first of all, that's the business of Swiss America, and Swiss America will get those dollars and again buy gold with them. So Swiss America is in the business of essentially buying gold, and they buy it with current dollars. If the dollar gets weaker and weaker, which it's going to cost more dollars to buy gold, and Swiss America will charge more. So right now, I think you should understand that if I'm correct, we're going into a massive recession, which I think is around the corner, then it's a good idea to have some gold and silver. But these first two stories, what I want to demonstrate here is that we are in the middle of some very fundamental economic shifts. Russia's on the move against the EU, against NATO, first in Ukraine. Now that Finland is also part of NATO, Russia's going to be looking to the north because Russia wants access through Finland and through Ukraine, through the Baltic Sea and through the Black Sea to the Atlantic. And what's happening is that the United States, in a sense, we're kind of committing economic suicide. In large part, the Green Movement, which I'll get to in a minute, is an economically suicidal movement, but predicated on neo-Marxism, this kind of utopian idea that we can utilize the electric and solar energy to replace hydrocarbon fuels. The science, I've written a book on this, which I think has been done extremely well, The Truth About Energy, Global Warming, and Climate Change. And anyone who really understands climate science knows that carbon dioxide, which is a greenhouse gas, is a minor portion. It's a small percentage of molecules of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, 0.004%, 4 1,000ths of 1%. And carbon dioxide is not the major greenhouse gas. Water vapor is. But the left doesn't demonize water vapor because hydrocarbon fuels don't produce water vapor. Now, I'm seeing in the next two stories about the SEC imposing climate rules on U.S. corporations. I've covered extensively through the last few shows the decision by the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, to impose new tailgate emission standards on vehicles produced in the United States for the United States market or sold in the United States, which will essentially be aimed at having 2/3 of all vehicles sold, I believe it's in 2032, be electric vehicles by mandate. Right now, electric vehicles are less than 6% of the market. This is an effort to, by regulations, force a re-engineering of the U.S. economy to away from hydrocarbon fuels. Now, what the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, is doing, and they are a regulator over the stocks of public companies. So public companies have to file quarterly reports on their activities with the SEC for investors to be able to have an accurate estimate of their earnings and their operational economics, their finances. And the SEC is now going to require reporting on carbon emissions. And not only that, they're going to impose regulations which will require businesses to submit plans showing how the business is going to this net zero emission standard. Net zero emission standard means there's no addition of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere because the business is in operation. Businesses net zeroing, they're taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, or they're going to solar and wind power, electricity. A couple of the real illusions here is that the left doesn't realize that hydrocarbon fuels are utilized to produce the electricity. And as long as that's the case, and as long as wind and solar are only about 12.5% of all the electricity generated in the United States, that you have an electric vehicle doesn't mean you're reducing carbon dioxide emissions. We exhale carbon dioxide. The science behind this, the carbon dioxide is noxious, is just not valid. Without greenhouse gases, the Earth would be not habitable. Too much of the sun's irradiance, which we absorb during the day when the sun is shining, would escape into the upper atmosphere at night when the sun is not shining if it weren't for greenhouse gases. So they're a fundamental part, a necessary part of the Earth's weather system. And furthermore, carbon dioxide has been much greater in geological times. We've had ice ages where carbon dioxide has been much greater percentage than it is in the United States or the world today. There's so many fallacies in this green movement. China and India are utilizing a maximum amount of coal. They have no intention of stopping. They are using hydrocarbon fuels. Their populations, India is just now overtaking China, about 1.4 billion people, and they're not about to stop using hydrocarbon fuels. But behind this regulatory movement is kind of an idea that if we just will it to be, John Lennon's imagine a world in which there is no oil or gas. Well, we don't have a world like that. It's completely fantasy. And the reality is hydrocarbon fuels are the cheap and abundant energy which has sustained the modern industrial society necessary to support the number of people that we have on the earth today. Without having these fuels, we will be in a much more difficult situation. But one more article, and Chris, I'm going to ask you to comment, which is that I'm also very kind of disturbed to see that the green movement is now going after banks that have net zero pledges, but yet they are financing fossil fuel companies. Now, again, there's so many fallacies here. As I point out in The Truth About Energy, Global Warming, and Climate Change, if you haven't read that book, I think you should. I mean, you've got to know some climate science, and you've got to understand why this movement is ideologically driven and not science-based. But the point is that oil, coal, natural gas are not fossil fuels. They were never created by fossils. When we die, when any organic material dies, it incinerates into its constituent chemicals, decomposes. It doesn't accelerate into a higher form of energy, hydrocarbons. That would violate the second law of thermodynamics, which is what inertia is about. Now, these are fundamental concepts in science, and everyone should be conversant with them. But the point is, the Earth itself produces oil, natural gas, coal, and does it on a constant basis. The Germans in the Weimar Republic had developed the Fischer-Tropsch equations. Germans produce synthetic oil. Synthetic oil is being produced in China right now. And it's a catalytic process where you take something that has hydrogen, something that has carbon, and under intense pressure and heat as the conditions in the mantle of the Earth, you have a catalytic reaction with something like iron oxide that turns the hydrogen and carbon, they bind and they form hydrocarbon chains. That's how oil, natural gas, methane, butane, all these other hydrocarbon chains are formed. And it's an ongoing process. It's natural to the Earth. It's not magic, and it's not dead dinosaurs. And that's why we didn't run out of oil. We won't run out of oil. We don't really know how much oil there is because it's constantly being produced. And in the book, I even show you that the Saudi Arabia oil fields are plentiful because they lie on top of great fractures in the tectonic base, the bedrock underneath Saudi Arabia is deeply fractured, which permits these hydrocarbon fuels to upgas and pool in sedimentary rock where our geologists think that the oil natural gas is formed. It's not formed there. It's pooled there. It's formed deeper in the mantle of the Earth. Chris, your thoughts?
Well, I can tell you this. You note that the banks that are and if you note they're actually they still exist. The ones that are maybe pledging the net zero thing here and there are still investing in fossil fuels. Look what happened to the banks that aren't doing so. Look what happened to the banks that invested solely or virtually only in environmental activist or environmental, let's just put it this way, climate change agenda activism, or whatever kind of woke policy that came to the bank, whether it be hiring or investing. They basically failed. A lot of these banks are sitting there saying, well, hold on a second, maybe I shouldn't hedge all of our bets in the climate change agenda. I think I know where this is going. And fossil fuels still are paramount to our existence at this point. And like you said, a lot of it's pretty much signaling to the rest of the world that the I'm going to say junk science, but it's really pseudoscience that the climate change agenda is pushing, such as carbon dioxide is horrible. What was it? Is it nitrogen that's evil now? That sort of thing.
Right. And nitrogen, methane. I mean, anything that is a hydrocarbon is evil. And it's engineered. It's engineered to produce less abundance. They want to end capitalism. That's the fundamental. The people pushing this agenda know that electric cars are not going to be available to everyone. And if you can't, if people can't afford electric cars, and probably a large percentage of Americans are just not going to be able to afford these vehicles, well, that's okay with the left, because they want to re-engineer. If you can control how people travel, you can control everything about their lives.
Well, if you remember correctly, the last 5 or 6, actually the last 15 years, many major cities were discussing the idea of congestion pricing when it comes to tolls and when it comes to commuters coming down to the city. Remember, Rudy Giuliani back in the day tried to charge commuters an extra bit of tax to come down and work in the city. On the other hand, what was it? Mayor Giuliani instilled the idea. I don't know if it went through yet because of COVID and everything else, but I do remember that the discussion was um, to push forth congestion pricing to penalize commuters or anybody going to Midtown or Lower Manhattan.
Well, there's cities will have to do something on congestion, and that's
Right.
typical. And they do charge quite a bit to come across on the bridges or the tunnels to get into New York. But the point is,
yeah,
but the point is, that's an issue where you're going to accept that people are going to have hydrocarbon, internal combustion engines. Now, I'm saying they want to eliminate internal combustion engines because they know it will limit the ability of people to have mobility, and fewer people will own cars. That's their goal. Their
right.
goal is to have these, to reduce things down to where, look at the left love the lockdowns. People locked down in their homes. Now everything is under control. It's a totalitarian control movement where capitalism depends upon mobility, freedom, the ability to take initiative, to act without being monitored or sponsored. And here we've got increasing regulations, which are going to look at every aspect of our lives from the point of view of carbon dioxide emissions. Now, if carbon dioxide was carbon monoxide and it was truly poison, I could see why the government would be concerned, but it's not. And carbon dioxide is, we exhale it. So the whole movement is making us our own problem. We're the Anthropocene, they call it, which means, this is the end of civilization, the end of humanity that we ourselves are causing. It's a suicidal movement. There's too many people. The best way, this place, Earth would be great if it weren't for so many people. These are insane ideas, which are negative and suicidal. And the left knows they're suicidal, and the left is happy to destroy. That's the problem, Chris. That's my point.
Right, and then the idea is they're also trying to force the use of public transportation, force less cars on the road, and pat themselves on the back over less emissions, where they get to run around freely and everybody else is locked up in, well, let's just say honeycombs.
Okay, let's go to the next two stories, because I put these stories together today in a way that tie together. The next story is really surprised me, which is that the Washington Post last week had an editorial in which they were saying that we need to get police into the schools. Now, after George Floyd was murdered, the Washington Post was one of the major editorial supporters of defund the police. They're saying many cities yanked officers out of schools while reassessing policing. Let's reimagine policing. Reimagining policing means making the schools vulnerable to attacks from insane shooters. However well-intentioned, the experiments left kids more vulnerable and classrooms less safe amid surging youth violence. I mean, are these people geniuses or what? Okay, DC should join them. The mayor, Bowser, has proposed fully funding the school resource officer program in her last 3 budgets, and the city council is resisting it. They should listen. This is the Washington Post, which is one of the most leftist newspapers in the country. Now, the problem of youth violence is serious. And the next story, so what I'm pointing out is that this agenda of the left, which is to reimagine all these things, the criminals are the victims. Let's have less police. Let's basically tax people for their economic activity. Let's remove vehicles so that they can't get mobility. Lock them down so that there's a pandemic and everybody will live imprisoned in their homes. Well, this article is showing basically that youth riots are going on across America. You've seen them now break out all across the country. We had over the weekend very little reported. There was a youth rampage in Chicago that tore up a good part of the city. And our cities are getting subject to these youth riots. Now, the article is asking the question, if people are this, the youth are going to riot like this and loot and destroy, what's going to happen when the economy, if we go into a severe economic recession? And I think that's a very serious question. That's one that, again, this is from the America First report. Michael Snyder wrote this. I think he's right, is that we need to be concerned if our cities become lawless and violence. We have the Congressional Committee looking at the violence in New York City, and the left doesn't want anybody to talk about this, but riots are occurring in places, youth riots in places like Kansas City. Protests have erupted in Kansas City after a black teenager was shot in the head and arm by a white homeowner last week for accidentally ringing the wrong doorbell. Well, I mean, that's, of course, a tragedy that happened. But then it triggers the youth riot, and that was, of course, the George Floyd pattern of having, and then the conclusion, defund the police, and let's just get rid of the police. That'll be the solution because the police are the problem. Well, finally, we're finding, and the youth at the left maybe begin to realize that having armed guards within a school may prevent school shootings, or certainly help to make them less violent, less murderous, because there'll be police there armed to take immediate action, not having to wait for a police response. These should be the kinds of common sense ideas that are not hard for people to understand. If you don't have police, if you have a lawless society, if you have hoodlums run things, if you have cities that are bankrupt, if you have economic activity that is depressed because of a green agenda, we're worrying about carbon dioxide, which we ought to be happy we're in an interglacial warming period. The Earth is always had violent weather. The weather on Earth exists to distribute heat. The heat of the sun is a big concept for the left. Carbon dioxide is not the thermometer of Earth's temperature. The sun is. That yellow thing up in the sky is not a tree ornament. It's what heats Earth. When we get farther from Earth, an elliptical orbit, about every 100,000 years, we have an ice age. When the sun is not burning as intensely, we have a little cold period, a little ice age. We had the time of Napoleon, George Washington crossing the Delaware, all those huge ice flows you see in the drawings, the pictures of it, the paintings. Well, the Delaware doesn't freeze like that anymore. The sun was in a dormant period, the Maunder minimum, it was called, during that period of time when the sun was less active and the Earth got colder. It wasn't carbon dioxide that increased. And the idea that it's only been industrial activity because we're burning hydrocarbon fuels that have caused the Earth's temperature to suddenly rise when in geological time it had not risen before is nonsense. The Earth has gone through innumerable ice ages and interglacial warming periods. The Earth has been warmer and the Earth has been colder. And it's not because of carbon dioxide. The ice age did not end, the last ice age, because the little cavemen, and they had their fires, their carbon fires in caves, and that's what ended the ice age. It's nonsense. And this is what's being taught in the schools. And not the fundamental. Climate science is quite intricate. It's nonlinear mathematics. The equations are not predictable. The equations have different outcomes depending upon how the variables interact. It's a fundamental mathematical principle that, again, I think is not taught in the schools, not at least except to the very few that manage to make it through advanced mathematics. At any rate, my point is that I think even the Washington Post is beginning to wake up to understand that this leftist agenda, this neo-Marxist agenda, is self-destructive. And that's what it's intended to be. Its architects understood that from the beginning. That's why they created it. It's a very powerful ideology. And they don't want to tolerate dissent because they know they can't win, not on the basis of science-based arguments. What we're dealing with is an attempt to end the Enlightenment, move away from reason, move away from fact-based, enter into John Lennon. Let's imagine there's no God. Well, you can imagine there's no God all you want, but when you die, good luck. This place is created by God, and God rules here. Satan would like to take over, and Satan at this point has the upper hand for the moment. Chris, any comments? I want to wrap up with one more thing, but any more comments?
I'm with you on all of this, because if you look at this, it's been a pattern for several years, and I know it's almost a meme to go back to this, but Saul Alinsky's what was it, the rules for radicals, right? That was the idea, was to demonize the opponent, repeat things over and over, kind of flatten out education a little bit.
Create narratives,
right, but keep repeating them, and then
yes,
shout down or demonize anybody who questions those narratives without arguing your point.
Yeah, it's an ideological battle. Now, I want to end up with talk about the other sponsor we have today, which is My Vital C. I've been taking it for 4 years. I went through the Mueller investigation. They wanted to imprison me. It was tremendously difficult. And they never did indict me. They offered me a plea deal, which I refused to take. My Vital C involves olive oil or various oils, coconut oil, sale of the dog, Chris. I always I like dogs, so a dog's bark, that's a good sign. And look,
lively.
I love dogs, so that's okay. I like animals. I like cats too. The point is that here, look, I'm over 70. I've taken this My Vital C for 4 years. I can give you my personal testimony. It gives you more energy. It keeps your mind. You just feel different. I feel different taking it. It's a molecule which is carbon 60. I've written a book on it with Chris Burries. We're going to create a website which is called getlongevitymeds.com. It's coming very soon. I'm very active in telemedicine. And if you try this, My Vital C, and again, you can go to the website and just click any one of the products you like. There's hair creams, there's creams for your body. There's the hair creams, I think, are terrific. It's actually brought color back to my hair. And I swear by these products. I think they're just terrific. Try them. I think you'll like them. Okay, so today I think we've kind of covered a lot of ground, and we've really tried to decode this agenda that's going on, which I think is economically ruinous. And I believe we are looking at the demise of the dollar. It's a massive paradigm shift that we're in right now in all kinds of different ways. And I want us to move back to a God-based society, to get out of this secular religion, to get back to a truth-based society, get back to a reason and fact-based society. In the end, God always wins, and God will win here too. This is Jerome Corsi. Today is April 18th, 2023. Thank you for joining us. We'll be back tomorrow, and we'll be broadcasting every weekday. God bless. Thank you.